Chapter 39. Dare glared through the blackness. Every hour or so, she'd taken to closing her eyes and rubbing them to see the patterns that emerged. Those were still in color, at least. She leaned her head against the bars. She couldn't sleep, so she waited until the darkness faded into the dull grayness of morning. She snorted when she heard footsteps, realizing she'd drifted off. Then she listened. These were much quicker and lighter than what she had expected. She watched. A small figure hugged the wall and then sprinted toward them. "Fallon!" She bit her tongue to avoid from yelling. The boy reached up with a ring of keys. He was grinning. "They keep everything in an office down the hall." Jacob moved like lightning to the front of the cell and glared at the child. "Boy, what the hell are you doing?" He snatched the keys. Fallon appeared wounded. He pointed. "There's only one guard, and there's another bunch of prisoners down the hall too. But I think most everyone's gone from here. It's like this ghost town Mama and I—" The knight tried several keys in the lock. "Yes, Fallon, I understand. How did you even get here? How did you escape capture?" The boy shrugged. "I hid like Dad said. But I still could hear, so I followed you. They didn't even look for me." "Because you're not supposed to be here." The knight finally found a key that clicked. "No one's come running. That's something, I suppose." Kelin hauled himself to his feet, supported by Dare. "So can we just go?" The door swung free to the knight's touch. "Well, let's take care of that guard and see what other poor bastards the Kelin have brought down here." "How are your eyes, Fallon?" Dare asked. The boy looked up at her with gray orbs. "Everything's a little clearer here. Different, but not weird." He cocked his head. "Are yours all right, Dare?" She nodded. Yeah." Jacob peered down the empty corridor. "I will find that guard. Feenan, you're with me." He tossed the keys at Dare. "You, Kelin, Fallon, go find the other prisoners, and if they're useful, let them out." "If they're useful," Kelin repeated. "See if they're friendly, or you can pat them on the back and send them to cover our escape. Useful. Now go." He pointed, and then he and Feenan vanished down the hall. The corridor was plain and that same dull, lackluster, patternless gray. Dare frowned, finding it difficult to fear a clean hallway. She had always imagined in those brief moments when they'd made up stories about the Kelin that they lived in dark places full of bloody skeletons. The outpost in the wildlands had fit that story. But here, in their home, she hadn't expected well-organized and well-swept buildings. This was almost boring. She glanced down the hall. The other barred door seemed to come out of a mirage. She looked back. Their cell already appeared a long way off. As they inched closer, she wondered who else the Storm Readers had locked away down here. They could be spies who had failed the Kelin like the cultists they had made into undead. Fallon gripped the back of her leg. He looked up. At least his eyes here were gray, and that would avoid an awkward explanation if the other prisoners were human or elves. He offered a grin. "You go first." Kelin nodded. "Yeah, Dare, you go first." She stopped walking. "I'd feel a lot better if I had a sword." The other shrugged and waved her ahead while they stayed put. She swallowed and stepped forward. Her gaze slipped through the bars and she sighed with relief. She looked over her shoulder at Kelin and Fallon. "Dwarves." She offered a small smile to the other prisoners. "Well met. We're, here to rescue you?" 3 dwarves clustered together. They looked like fallen warriors, sitting in squalor on the floor. Their hair and magnificent beards were matted and frazzled. One of them opened an eye, and he stared. Dare scrambled to find the correct key, and cursed as every key so far fit, but didn't turn. Kelin and Fallon sneaked up behind her. A dwarf pushed himself to his feet and tottered forward. When he arrived at the bars, he squinted and leaned toward her. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a pair of thick spectacles. He slipped them over his eyes. "Humans?" he said in common. He took a turn staring at each of them. He removed his spectacles, buffed them on his torn sleeve, and put them back on. Dare smiled as a key turned. "We, just escaped from down the hall." She heaved the door open. The dwarf spoke quickly to the others in a guttural language. He whirled back. "How were you captured and brought to this hell?" Her grin widened. "Oh, we were caught trying to raid this place. How about you?" Behind her, Kelin covered his eyes with his hand. None of the dwarves moved toward the door. "Is something wrong?" she asked. The dwarf shook his head, sending his beard swaying. "Aside from being in Dark Rain itself, prisoners of the accursed Kelin and being rescued by mad children, no." She grinned. "Oh, we have a plan. We don't exactly have a plan to escape since we didn't know what to expect in Dark Rain, but we'll figure it out. Not to worry." Behind him, one of the other dwarves muttered something that sounded like rocks being kicked around. The speaker then looked to Dare. "He wants to know if you're daft." "Yes," Kelin stated. "However, we would like to get the hell out of here with our hides intact. You're welcome to come." He darted into the cell. "Can you all stand and walk? My name's Kelin Miller of Riversbridge." The bespectacled dwarf nodded. "Yes, we're able." Once more, he took his time to study all three of them. "I am Carrick. It's best to say short names for now. These are Boyson and Striggle. We're of Clan Heavyaxe." Dare grinned. "I know that name." Kelin offered his hand to one of the reclining dwarves and seemed to strain as he helped the dwarf to stand. "Dulangar, right?" "Yeah," she replied. "Seems like a year ago." Fallon, standing guard in the hall, peered around anxiously. "Can we go already?" Carrick pointed at Fallon. "That boy a half-elf?" Dare and Kelin froze under that gaze, but Kelin eventually nodded. Yes." He swiveled his head. "Here come the captain and Feenan. Oh, they don't look happy." Jacob, wearing his recovered armor and weapons, carried 2 backpacks in one hand. Carrick stared up and down at him. "Dragoon?" "Silver Dawn," the knight answered. "You with them? How did you land here truly?" "We were betrayed." Feenan bunched a fist at his side, but his gaze fell to Fallon. He sighed as he looked away. "Let's just leave." He pulled at a backpack and retrieved his mail shirt. He tossed Dare's to her. She struggled to pull the armor over her shoulders. "Right." She glanced up the quiet corridor and turned to Jacob. "Our swords?" He pointed down at the backpack. 3 dwarven axes, with a pickaxe on one side and a fighting axe on the other, and 2 short swords poked their handles out of one, but they weren't the swords they had brought. Feenan and Kelin snatched up the swords before she could. She huffed as she scooped up a small knife and stuck it into her belt. "We can't leave without my dad," Fallon piped up. "I thought he'd be with you." Kelin bent down to Fallon's level. "Your dad's got the best chance for surviving down here, so I'm sure he's fine. Which way is out?" Fallon pointed down the hall. "I've oft wondered what this building is," Carrick rumbled as they began to walk. "It's too neat to be a proper prison." "The cells are real enough," Dare muttered. "I don't think that it is, Sir Dwarf," Feenan responded quietly. "Ghost town," Fallon whispered. "It reminds me—" Feenan hummed a little to himself. "It reminds me of those town halls in the Empire." "What halls?" Dare asked. "Walk." Jacob waved them toward a corner, and they fell in line behind him. They passed into a new, identical corridor. The doors here weren't barred, but instead crafted of solid wood. Dare nudged Feenan. "What were you going to say?" The elf ducked his head and whispered, "Just that every city, even the small towns, had them. They had quite a lot in them.
Government, the medicinal hub, the local jail, libraries, and schools,
Jacob finished. He pointed into one of the rooms they were sneaking past. In the back of the room were bunks, stacked all the way from the floor to the ceiling. In the center were wooden desks, arranged into rows and facing the front. There were also a couple of windows high on the exterior wall. "This room's the same," Dare called from across the corridor.
"I guess this is where they send the Kelin children,"
Carrick mused.
"Those desks are too small for anything other than little ones."
"Why are they empty?" Fallon asked. Jacob shook his head and shrugged.
"They're off to war."
"What, like fighting?" Dare narrowed her eyes.
"Probably cooking, cleaning, those things. They're not meant to fight."
"This way." Fallon pointed. Then he stared at the dwarves. "Why are you here?"
"There was a man with a young girl,"
Carrick whispered as they tiptoed down the hall.
"We thought he was human, but it was the girl I didn't trust. She sat there, didn't ask questions, and didn't look around. I've never seen a human child not at least nervous to be in a dwarf hall."
He shrugged.
"It was too dark, and the man had his face hidden by a hood, so we didn't see the colour of their eyes until it was too late."
He gestured to Boyson and Striggle.
"We were the only ones in our outpost who survived, and that was 8 years ago."
"You've been down here for 8 years?" Dare barked.
"Did you think the Kelin were rushing headlong into whatever they're doing?"
She hesitated. "I hope they are now." The dwarf hung his head.
"We remember the horror of the Storm Raider tales, but we too fooled ourselves into thinking that they had perished. I was sure they were going to use us when they set out on our cities."
Dare snorted. "Is it only humans that don't know that the Kelin existed then?" Feenan shrugged.
"Dwarven history isn't as fragmented as human history is, especially after Palin's died."
She felt her face flush. "We're learning now." Jacob asked,
Sir Carrick, do your companions speak common as well?"
Boyson nodded.
"Small, speak small. Ah, that's good. You can understand us."
Boyson and Striggle nodded.
"Yes,"
they said. The party rounded another corner and started down a new corridor. Jacob glanced around.
"I hope we haven't been this way before."
Dare fought against folding her arms. "Looks like it." Fallon pointed. "There's the door. It's the same one I came through, I think." The knight raised his hand.
"All right, spread out. Poke your noses up against the glass and watch for activity. We're not stepping a foot outside only to be shown right back in."
Dare, Kelin, and Fallon tiptoed into a classroom. It looked like the previous one, with the bunks and desks all in order. They pushed a desk over to the wall, but it was too short. "Let's try with both." Dare dragged a second desk across the floor. Stacked together, she still had to stretch to gaze over the lip of the window. She held her breath and watched. To her surprise, the sun's white light briefly blinded her. She covered her eyes and squinted. All she could make out were some white, square buildings and forest. Gray trees hiding in black shadows slouched in gray light.
Do you see any Kelin?"
Kelin asked from below as he studied the desks. She refocused her gaze. "No, but—" She tried to look harder. "No, I don't. This is unlike anything I've ever seen, though." Feenan materialized in the doorway.
"Any luck?"
Kelin nodded.
"No Kelin."
The elf smiled grimly.
"All right then, let's meet at the door."
Dare climbed down and they followed him away from the classroom. She tossed a glance over her shoulder, smirking at the two desks now completely out of place. She darted back inside the room and kicked over a third desk. Then she trotted after the others to the exit. She crowded up next to the door with everyone. Jacob bent low.
"The plan is that we run out in twos. No one stops until they get beyond the tree line. Close the door most of the way, then wait to the count of 100 before you follow. I'm going first with Feenan, then Boyson and Striggle, Kelin and Fallon, Dare and Carrick. Understood?"
"Yes, sir," Kelin and Dare whispered. The others nodded. He heaved the door open, and after a quick sweep of his eyes, he and Feenan dashed out of the building. 1, 2, 3. 100 count later, Boyson and Striggle vanished into the grey forest. The count started over, and then Kelin and Thalin were gone. Suddenly, 100 passed. Carrick nudged Dare. "Fly, fly!" She and the dwarf pushed their heads through the door and took the plunge. She sprinted, eyes nailed ahead in the trees, expecting arrows in her back any second. Then she noticed that the dwarf wasn't beside her anymore. She glanced behind to see him in a tottering run, but she didn't dare stop. Once into the trees, she nearly collapsed on top of the others. Feenan nodded. "Breathe." Carrick careened into a tree and latched onto it. He wheezed, glaring at Dare. "We've been locked up for 8 years, Longlegs." She held up her hands. "I didn't say anything." She caught Jacob's glance, and he shook his head. She turned back toward the building, trying to remember if she had closed the door behind them. The knight snapped a twig off the nearest branch. "Trees aren't healthy." Dare looked down. The needles under their feet were dry and small. She craned her neck high and saw bare twigs poking out from thin branches. The dwarf shrugged. "Everyone all right?" Jacob asked. "Let's march."